The village of Hollow's End had always been cloaked in mystery, its cobbled streets winding toward the ancient clock tower that dominated the skyline. The tower loomed high above, its broken clock forever frozen in place, as though marking the exact moment when the world had shifted. Wren had lived here all his life, but recently strange things had begun to happen. People were disappearing, only to return with no faces, their identities lost to the void. Every night, Wren dreamt of the tower, its silent gears turning in the dark. No one could explain why the Faceless ones returned without a word. Whispers swirled around the town about a curse tied to the clock tower, but no one dared approach it after dark. Wren felt the pull of the tower growing stronger with each passing day, as if something within was calling to him. He'd always known the tower had secrets, but now he wondered if those secrets had begun to unravel. His friends, Nina and Mira, had warned him to stay away, but there was a feeling deep inside him that he couldn't ignore, the sense that his fate was intertwined with the ticking clock. As the days turned colder, the unease in the village deepened. Jasper, a local craftsman and friend of Wren's, began to notice something peculiar. The faces of those who returned were not entirely lost. Reflections in windows and puddles showed fleeting glimpses of their former selves, as though trapped in the mirror world, begging to be released. This discovery filled Wren with dread, yet also a strange, undeniable curiosity. What if the tower held the answers? One evening, as the fog rolled in and the sky darkened, Wren stood before the clock tower's doors. The cold air clung to his skin, and his reflection in the tower's glass seemed different. He glanced away, feeling as though his face had started to blur, just like the others. With trembling hands, he pushed open the door, and a rush of stale air met him, as if the tower had been waiting for him all along. The silence inside was oppressive, and with each step, Wren could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. Within the tower, time itself seemed to bend. The air was thick with dust, and the walls echoed faint whispers, voices of those who had entered before, perhaps never to return. Wren's heart raced as he climbed the spiraling staircase, each step bringing him closer to the source of the curse. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, yet the presence was strangely familiar, as though it had always been a part of him. The final stretch of stairs led to the clock's core, where something far darker than he had imagined awaited him. As Wren ascended the clock tower's narrow staircase, the weight of the air around him grew heavier. Every creak of the ancient wood beneath his feet sent shivers down his spine, as if the tower itself was reacting to his presence. The further he climbed, the more the walls seemed to close in, their cryptic carvings twisting in unnatural ways. Shadows danced in the flickering light, and Wren could hear the faintest echoes of whispered voices, familiar yet distant. Outside, the village of Hollow's End remained eerily silent, its streets swallowed by fog. Nina and Mira waited anxiously by the tower's base, watching for any sign of Wren. "He's been in there too long," Mira whispered, her voice trembling. Nina nodded, her eyes fixed on the cracked clock face above. Time felt distorted, as if the tower had its own grip on reality. Jasper had ventured out to find help, but deep down, they both knew no one could stop what was happening. Wren's head throbbed with a dull ache as he reached the clock's core, a massive mechanism of gears and chains suspended in the gloom. The air buzzed with energy, and the sight of it sent a chill through him. It was as if the heart of the tower was alive, its pulse slow and deliberate. As Wren approached, a sudden sharp pain shot through his face. He stumbled backward, gasping, and for a fleeting moment his hands brushed his face, only to find it was smooth, featureless, like the Faceless ones. Panic surged through him, and he backed away from the clock's mechanism, struggling to understand what was happening to him. The whispers grew louder now, no longer distant but right in his ear, urging him to let go, to surrender to the tower's will. "You are becoming one of them," a voice whispered, soft yet filled with dread. Ren's heart raced as he fought to maintain control, but the more he resisted, the stronger the pull became. Down below, Nina and Mira stood frozen as the clock began to tick once more, the sound cutting through the fog like a death knell. The hands moved slowly, each tick sending waves of dread through the village. "It's starting," Mira gasped, clutching Nina's arm. The two looked at each other, knowing they had to do something before Ren was lost forever. With determination, they started toward the tower's entrance, ready to face whatever awaited them inside. At the heart of the clock tower, Ren stood before the massive gears and chains that powered the broken clock. The mechanism was ancient, creaking with an almost sentient awareness as it slowly turned. The room was bathed in an eerie glow, cast from the strange symbols carved into the walls, symbols that seemed to pulse with life. Ren's face tingled, his skin pulling tighter, and when he reached up to touch his face, it was completely smooth, featureless. The horror of the realization hit him like a wave, but it was too late. He had become one of them. The clock's hands moved faster now, as if sensing Ren's surrender to the curse. The ticking grew louder, reverberating through the tower with a power that felt as if it were bending time itself. Ren stumbled backward, panic surging through him, but the pull of the clock was too strong. It wanted him, needed him, to complete the transformation. As he collapsed to his knees, shadows twisted around him, forming the vague shapes of the Faceless ones. They loomed closer, drawn to him as if recognizing him as one of their own. Nina and Mira burst through the tower's door, their faces pale with fear as they ascended the stairs. The air inside was thick with oppressive energy, and each step felt like a struggle. As they reached the top, they froze at the sight of Ren, now barely recognizable as the friend they once knew. His face was gone, a smooth, haunting blankness in its place. "Ren!" Nina cried out, rushing toward him, but the faceless figures began to materialize from the shadows, blocking her path. The room filled with a low hum, the very air vibrating as the Faceless ones closed in around Ren. "We can't let him go!" Mira shouted, grabbing Nina's arm. The clock's gears turned faster, its power almost overwhelming, but something about Ren's presence kept it from completing its cycle. Mira glanced at the carvings on the wall, realizing that the symbols held the key to stopping the transformation, but they had to act fast. The ticking grew deafening, and time seemed to stretch as the Faceless ones reached out for Ren. Desperation clawed at them as they frantically tried to decipher the carvings. Just as the Faceless ones moved to claim Ren, Mira shouted the final incantation. The clock tower shook violently, the gears screeching to a halt. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. The Faceless ones recoiled, their forms dissolving into the shadows. Ren collapsed, his body trembling, but his face remained featureless, lost forever to the curse. The tower fell silent, save for the faint ticking that never fully stopped. The tower stood silent now, the ticking of the clock reduced to a faint, almost imperceptible hum. Ren lay motionless on the cold stone floor, his face forever lost to the curse that had claimed so many before him. Nina and Mira knelt beside him, their eyes filled with tears. "We were too late," Nina whispered, her voice trembling. The eerie glow from the carvings had faded, and the Faceless ones had dissolved into shadows, leaving only an unsettling stillness behind. The air in the tower was heavy, thick with the weight of what had transpired. Mira glanced at the clock mechanism, still slowly turning despite their efforts to stop it. "It's not over," she said, her voice barely audible. The curse lingered, hanging over them like a cloud, and they knew the village was still in danger. As long as the clock continued to tick, the Faceless curse would remain, slowly consuming Hollow's End. Outside the tower, the village was unchanged, the fog still clinging to the streets like a shroud. But something was different, subtle yet palpable. The villagers who had once been taken by the curse began to stir, their faceless forms wandering aimlessly. Jasper had returned, watching in horror as the faceless ones roamed the village, their lost identities forever etched into the shadows. There was no way to bring them back. Nina and Mira helped Ren to his feet, his body weak but alive. His face, however, remained featureless, a blank slate that would never again reflect the person he had once been. "We have to destroy the clock," Mira insisted, her gaze fixed on the ancient mechanism. "It's the only way to stop this." But the task seemed impossible. The clock was tied to something far older, far darker than they had realized. Its gears turned with a will of their own, bound by forces they couldn't fully comprehend. As they descended the staircase, Ren paused, his hand brushing the cold stone wall. A sudden flash of memory surged through him, a vision of the Clocktower in its prime, untouched by the decay that now plagued it. The Faceless Ones had once been guardians, protectors of the village, and the clock was their prison. He turned to Nina and Mira, his blank face somehow conveying urgency. "We have to break the cycle," he said, his voice hollow but determined. The only way to end the curse was to free the Faceless Ones, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Ren, Nina and Mira stood before the heart of the Clocktower once more, their faces etched with determination. The air was thick with the weight of the curse, the silent ticking of the clock filling the room. Ren's face, now permanently smooth and featureless, seemed to reflect a deep sense of finality. "We have to end this," he whispered, though his voice was a hollow echo of the person he once was. The cryptic carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, as if daring them to try. With one final look at each other, they began to dismantle the clock. Gears clanged, and chains fell to the floor as they pulled apart the ancient mechanism that had kept the village trapped in its cursed cycle. Each piece felt heavier than the last, as though the clock itself was resisting. But they pressed on. The room shuddered with the clock's last desperate attempt to hold itself together. It was clear that whatever dark force bound it was not willing to let go so easily. As the final piece of the mechanism was torn free, the entire tower groaned, and the cryptic carvings flared to life one last time. The Faceless Ones, silent, looming figures, emerged from the shadows, watching. Ren stared at them, his featureless face reflecting their own, and for a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. The Faceless Ones did not attack or threaten. Instead, they stood still, as though waiting for something only Ren could give them. A sudden realization struck him. The Faceless Ones had never been the enemy. They were the victims, trapped by the very curse that had taken him. They had been protectors once, guardians of the village now imprisoned by the Clocktower's dark power. Ren stepped forward, his blank face filled with a kind of understanding. "You can be free," he whispered. With that, he reached out and shattered the last piece of the clock. The tower trembled, its walls cracking as the curse unraveled. The Faceless Ones began to fade, their forms dissolving into mist, but there was no sense of loss, only release. As the last of them vanished, the clock tower itself collapsed, its ancient stones crumbling into dust. The fog lifted from the village, revealing clear skies for the first time in years. But Ren remained, his face lost forever. He looked at Nina and Mira, who stood silently beside him. They had broken the curse, but the cost was clear. Ren would never be the same. With a heavy heart, they turned and walked away, leaving behind the ruins of the past and the shadow of forgotten faces.